Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down decades of controversy surrounding one of the world's most talked about figures. We're going to use documented sources to build a really clear four-pillar structure so you can understand the major events that have defined a career in business, media, and of course, politics. Okay, let's dive right in.
You know, to really get the story, you first have to understand the playbook. And that playbook was pretty much written by one man, Roy Cohn, Donald Trump's notoriously ruthless lawyer and mentor. This sentence you see here, it's way more than just a motto. It's a philosophy, and it's one that echoes through pretty much every single controversy we're about to explore. So that's our first pillar, the Cohn playbook. This is the absolute foundation. These aggressive, uncompromising tactics that were learned right at the side of one of New York's most infamous political and legal fixers. Yeah, Cohn's reputation came straight from his client list. I mean, he wasn't just some tough lawyer. He was the go-to guy for the heads of the Genovese and Gambino crime families. According to reports, Trump would call him almost daily for advice, learning to treat lawsuits not as legal disputes but as all-out wars to be won at any cost.
And that connection? It had very practical applications. Back in the New York of the 1980s, you just couldn't build a giant skyscraper without dealing with a construction industry that was heavily influenced by organized crime, everything from the unions to the concrete suppliers. Cohn was the key that unlocked all of those doors.
And you can really see this connection play out during the construction of his signature building, Trump Tower. Court records and some deep investigative reporting paint this picture of a project built with mob-linked concrete and the labor of about 200 undocumented Polish workers. And they faced brutal conditions. We're talking 12-hour-plus shifts, paid in cash way below union wages, and working without even basic safety gear. The whole situation eventually led to a lawsuit over union pension fraud, which years later was settled.
And this wasn't just about some business deal and had a very real-world impact. This quote from actual court testimony just captures the desperation and the exploitation that was alleged by the people who were actually there swinging the sledgehammers.
So, that aggressive playbook was then used to build a global brand. And that brings us to our second pillar, the business of the brand. This is where the public story often ran parallel to a very different, documented reality.
So here you can see the core of the brand right next to the financial record. On one hand, you have this powerful story of the self-made billionaire, but that's challenged by a 2018 New York Times investigation that found he received what would be, today, over $413 million from his father's real estate empire. And then you have the master dealmaker image, which is incredibly strong, but his casino and hotel businesses actually filed for Chapter 11 corporate bankruptcy 6 separate times.
Now, this number represents another one of those clashes between branding and reality. $25 million. That's the amount that was paid to settle a whole bunch of lawsuits against an entity that carried his name, Trump University.
And, you know, the crucial thing here is who said this. This wasn't just some disgruntled student. This was sworn testimony from a former manager of the program. He described a playbook that he said was designed to target vulnerable people, which is a pretty stark contrast to the marketing that was promising elite real estate secrets from Trump's own hand-picked experts.
Okay, let's dive into our third pillar, a network of influence. Here, we're going to explore the powerful and, let's be honest, sometimes deeply controversial associations that have been a constant throughout his rise in social and political circles.
And perhaps no association has drawn more scrutiny than his with the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. The documented record shows this long period of socializing, from parties at Mar-a-Lago to flights on Epstein's jet, though it is important to note the logs show no trips to his infamous private island. The timeline also includes Trump's now famous 2002 quote, calling Epstein a terrific guy, which is then followed by a ban from his club years later, and it all culminated in that massive 2026 document dump.
So what did those millions of pages actually reveal? Well, this table sums it up. The files confirmed what was already pretty much known, the extensive social connections. They also had these old, unverified tips that the Department of Justice itself called salacious and sensationalist. But what's really crucial is the bottom line. According to the DOJ, the releases contain no new evidence of any criminal involvement by Trump.
All right, now let's look at a totally different kind of influence, the financial kind. This staggering figure, over $100 million, is the estimated contribution that mega donor Miriam Adelson and her family made to pro-Trump efforts in just the 2024 election cycle. That made her arguably the most influential single donor in that entire election.
And the connection between that money and actual policy, well, it wasn't exactly hidden.
In a 2025 speech, Trump publicly gave Adelson credit for major U.S. foreign policy shifts, including moving the American embassy to Jerusalem. It's a really direct acknowledgement, and it's one that fuels that ongoing debate about just how much massive donations influence American politics.
And that brings us to our final pillar, the price of power. Here we're going to look at the documented, real-world human impact of policies that were enacted from the highest office in the entire country.
Let's just start with this number. Over 5,500. According to government reports and groups like the ACLU, that's the estimated number of children who were separated from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border under a very specific 2018 policy.
That policy was called zero tolerance. The stated goal was to deter illegal immigration. But the practical result was that when adults were taken for prosecution, their children were, by default, separated from them. This created a humanitarian crisis. The backlash was, just intense, especially after that audio of sobbing children was leaked and the policy was officially reversed by an executive order. And behind all the policy debates and the statistics, there are stories of just profound trauma. This quote from a father who was deported while his child was lost in the U.S. foster care system for years, it speaks to a depth of pain that numbers can never, ever capture.
So when you put it all together, you see these four distinct but totally connected pillars. It's a story that starts with this ruthless playbook learned back in 1970s New York, which is then applied to build a brand, which is then amplified by a network of influential allies, and it ultimately leads to policies with deep, lasting human consequences.
Look, we've laid out the documented record from a ton of sources, from court testimony to government reports. And the whole point of this explainer is to put that record into a clear structure. So the final question, what this all says about power, accountability, and the stories we tell ourselves, well, that's ultimately left for you to decide.